What is up, everybody? Welcome to another edition of the Touchline Talk Show. Thank you so much for tuning in. So used to just being in a Champions League routine at this point, but it was a midweek set for domestic leagues to get those extra games in because of the World Cup, whether that's league games, cup games, whatever it might be. So we're going to get to all of that here at the beginning, and then second part of the show, playoff time. MLS, NWSL, terrific slate of games coming up starting Thursday night all the way through the weekend. So I'm going to walk through all of them, talk about sort of the biggest storylines, the keys to those games, and set the stage for what should be a fantastic week of soccer here in the U.S. But as I said, we're going to start midweek action, and the only place to start is Manchester United beating Tottenham in the game of this midweek slate anywhere in Europe, and of course, going to focus primarily on the Premier League here. And after I talk about this game, I was going to talk about a couple different ones that happened today. But instead, based on sort of what's been going on and the results of these Wednesday midweek games, I want to actually just sort of talk about the league as a whole and specifically the top of it and these big six teams and sort of where they're all at. So that's what we're going to do next. But I couldn't and didn't want to ignore what Manchester United did. And this game really left me with a lot of things I wanted to say, so I want to take a while to talk about it here. First, I can't remember the last time I saw Manchester United control a game against an opponent with elite talent the way they did this one. Now, was it perfect? Certainly not. Did they control all 90 minutes? No. But when you're 2 goals ahead with 15 minutes to go, you don't need to be in control. You can just sit back, play defense, and attack on the counter. So I'm not holding that against United at all. When it mattered for the first 60, 75 minutes of this game, Manchester United were not just winning, they were actually dictating the terms of the game. And this is the huge difference. This is the kind of stuff you want to see when you're talking about progress under Erik ten Hag. The kind of stuff his teams were so good at when you're talking about Ajax. Now, maybe not necessarily against the very, very best teams in the world, but against teams that were better, more talented than they were even, they had the ability to not only play an incredibly attractive brand of soccer, but to be multidimensional and to actually use the ball, possess the ball, to impose their will on a game. And that is something United has struggled with forever. Jose Mourinho, Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, the sort of framework, the blueprint was the same, and it was built on counterattacking. One of the biggest narratives that United needs to address to take the next step and actually become a factor in a title race again is their consistent inability to break teams down that just sit there. Right? You see it all the time. I mean, to a certain extent, you saw it against Newcastle a matter of days ago, which makes Tottenham a really, really interesting test for Manchester United. Because I said before the Manchester Derby, I'm not sure how much we're going to be able to learn about United here. Because this game, now it didn't end up going this way, and I'll get back to this game later on. But that game was set up for United to be able to play on the counter because Manchester City is all about possession and control. Tottenham is all about sitting back, counterattacking, and trying to control a game through defense and winning 1-0. So to get this win in this fashion is a really, really good sign for Manchester United. It wasn't breathtaking stuff in attack, but when you control the ball, when you have a majority of the possession, you can do things like take shots that aren't exactly supposed to go into the net. And when a team is in a low block and a bunch of guys are just all over the penalty box, Sometimes you get fortunate and you get a deflection and the ball goes in and you're winning 1-0. And that completely changes the game because it ruins Tottenham's game plan. That's the kind of stuff that you don't get to do when you're only relying on counterattacks. So that is a major, major plus and one of my biggest takeaways from this game. If Manchester United can do that more often, because even in some of their wins this season, I didn't feel like they had really ever had control of the game against Arsenal. It's why I wasn't worried about Arsenal coming out of it. Yeah, United had some good moments. They scored some goals. But it was never convincing the way it was in this game. And some of their more famous wins recently, not of the convincing variety. And the second part of this is defensively. Since that Manchester City game, United have given up 1 goal in their 3 Premier League games. Now, I understand Europa League is a different conversation that I don't really want to get into right now. There are still offensive issues, and I will address that in a minute here. But in the Premier League, defensively, since they've gotten sort of set up the way Ten Hag wants, they have been really, really good with the exception of that Manchester City game. And I said after that Manchester City game, I'm not sure this is really a commentary on United as much as it is just there is nobody in the world that can do anything about that when City shows up and 5 attacking players are all playing like they're the best player on the field. And I feel even more confident in that assessment now based on what United have done since. All that being said, I am still not convinced by this attack that you can get the goals you need game in and game out to keep pace with the best teams in this league. However, they are getting more consistent. I am trusting them more. I do believe this is significant progress. You just see some of the wasted chances over these last couple games, specifically Marcus Rashford. You see what's happened in the Europa League. There's still a ways to go. But Ten Hag is beginning to shift the narrative for me. He's changing the way I feel. They are, from a game-to-game standpoint, becoming more reliable. And that's the first step. It's going to be a process. It is going to take time. And to a certain extent, I almost think this question of is United back is kind of a silly one because A, it's relative, and B, it's not like there's going to be one game where they come back. That's just not how this works, especially with where they've been. It's going to be a slow climb forward, but they are making real progress. On the Spurs side of this, I understand Dejan Kulusevski isn't there. You're really short in attack at the moment. Richarlison also unavailable. Lucas Moura comes off the bench. The attackers and the front three, the way Conte designed it and wanted it with this transfer window, is not available. I understand that, and I don't care. You had Harry Kane and Son Heung-min out there. That's more than enough attacking talent. And today was the point where I decided I'm done sort of giving this team the benefit of the doubt and being patient that they're going to figure this out in attack. I have said this before, and I will continue to say it. And this is in no way contradictory to what I said in the weekend roundup about Manchester City being more vulnerable than people acknowledge, and the fact that they are not playing at this unbeatable level. It's an incredibly high bar still. You cannot hang with the top teams in this league, be it City, the way Arsenal are playing. We'll get to some of the other teams here in a little bit. With a one-dimensional strategy of trying to play for a clean sheet and counter a goal on a counterattack by absorbing pressure and hoping you can release your attackers from that. Because it is not going to work a high enough percentage of the time to pick up the amount of points you need to get into a title conversation. It is that simple. Is it enough to get into the top 4? Maybe. But Conte is not brought into Spurs just to get into the top four. That money was not spent over the summer to reinforce this team the way he wanted to get into the top four. And they've just been incredibly disappointing. And I understand. Off to their best start in 50 whatever years, or whatever that number is, on paper it doesn't look bad. But when you actually, and I've seen Spurs fans acknowledge this, when you actually look at a game-by-game breakdown, it's just not pretty. And so when you actually go down a goal, you're in big trouble because your entire approach is predicated on being able to keep that clean sheet until you launch the counter to score the goal. And it's also reliant upon your strikers taking an incredibly high percentage of the chances that are created, because you're not going to create all that many. With Kane and Son in the team, that's not as big of a concern for me. But there are so many things that have to go right for this approach to work. And there is no reason this group of players should only be able to win this way. There's way too much talent across the board. And this also gets into the one-dimensional thing. I talk about this in the context of the playoffs in particular, but it's also true when you're trying to chase this bar set by Manchester City. You got to be able to win more than one way. There are going to be games where you give up a weird goal like this one, where your attack doesn't click, where you miss a couple chances you would normally finish. Whatever it might be, you have to have, and this is where I'm seeing evolution with United. You got to be able to do it more than one way. And Spurs have shown no ability to do that basically this season, with maybe the exception of that Leicester second half, but that was just Son being his brilliant self. Every once in a while, that's going to bail you out. But even Harry Kane, here's the other number that's deceiving. I think I saw somewhere Harry Kane's off to his best start of his Premier League career in terms of goals per game, or amount of goals scored through 10 games or whatever it is. But how many of those have come on penalty kicks and set pieces, right? The corners and the PKs. He's not scoring all that many goals from the run of play. And you had that stretch where Son wasn't scoring, and that now he's really started to pick it up. He didn't have a good game in this one. But no, all of this just feels incredibly deceiving to me when you look at the actual numbers, the points, the record, all of that stuff. It is not sustainable to play this way, and there's no reason Spurs have to play this way. This is a choice by Antonio Conte. And it might work in Italy. And I mean, I guess in his defense, he's gotten it to work in England. I would just argue he got it to work in England before the bar was this high. And before you had Manchester City's, 98-point, 100-point seasons. And again, that's not the Manchester City team of this season. We're talking more probably in the 90 to 93 range. But now you also have Arsenal, who are not dropping points, and these other teams to deal with. There is nothing to point to other than this is an intentional choice by Spurs that is not conducive to getting where they want to be. That is the bottom line for me. It'll work sometimes, but it's not going to work enough for you. And it might not even be enough to get into the top four. I'm going to have that conversation here in a minute. There is too much talent for it to look this bad this consistently, and especially against the better teams they play. It's one thing to play on the counter against Manchester City, and Spurs have had significant success doing that recently. That is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about going extended periods of time, entire halves, without being a factor in attack and doing it, North London Derby. And in this game. Now, they did respond in the North London Derby. This one, they didn't even really come that close to responding. I mean, Lloris kept him in the game in the first half before the goal started going in. It is just not a sustainable way to play. And now it's starting to come back to bite them. I was really high on this team. I thought this was going to look a lot better than it has. And this was kind of the breaking point for me. To watch it happen again and them just be so lethargic and have so few ideas going forward. in the moments in this game where it actually mattered. I am curious to see if Conte is going to keep doing this or if he's going to let these guys really go after it and attack. I'm all for having a defensive base you build off of. What I am not for is being so reliant on that defensive base that you only try and win one way. And you have all this attacking talent that lets you do so many other things if you would just give it a chance. All right, so that is that game. And I also want to take some time to talk about the bigger picture at the top of this league right now. Because I can't remember a point where I felt the gap between just talking about the Big Six for a second, team number 1 and team number 6 was this small. Now, it's still significant, don't get me wrong. I'm not here saying that Manchester City and whichever team you have at the bottom are similar. Not what I'm saying at all. But there was always a team or two that you just kind of realized didn't have it and weren't going to be Champions League contenders. Usually it was United or Tottenham. And, Chelsea would have a weird season here or there. And by and large, the past 5 or so seasons, you're very confident in Manchester City and Liverpool. But now you have this situation where, as I talked about on Monday, and go back and watch that video if you want to hear more about this, but this is there for the taking if somebody can put it together for 38 games. I'm still picking City to win, but this is a title race. It's not can somebody catch City, it's can somebody keep pace, and there's a difference. For me, everything in these midweek games reinforced the idea that the two teams who didn't play, Arsenal, are making up their Europa League game with PSV that got postponed tomorrow, Thursday, which is why they didn't play Manchester City today. That game got postponed, which results in neither Arsenal or Manchester City playing in this midweek slate for the Premier League. Those two teams are a step above everybody else. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. I am all in on Arsenal, and nobody needs convincing about Manchester City's greatness. After that, I've got no clue what to rate the other 4 teams. I just talked for 15 minutes about my concerns about United and Spurs. I am also buying Chelsea under Graham Potter. Also a Chelsea team that dropped points against Brentford today. And then there's the Liverpool angle of this. Mo Salah looks like himself again. That is a massive deal in terms of Liverpool's hopes of getting into the top 4. I think the title hopes are already gone with the poor start they had. But they got themselves back into the mix by beating Manchester City and following that up with not a great performance, but they got the job done against West Ham. Defensively, it's been much better. They seem to have figured out some of those issues. Some of those players are just performing better. You thought you were going to lose Trent Alexander for a little bit at least, and it appears he's recovered. He's already back playing. The one thing, though, and I talked about I don't want to hear excuses on the injury front for Arsenal, or for Tottenham, sorry. Jota, Diaz are gone for an extended period of time, which leaves you with Salah, Nunez, Firmino. And, Klopp and understandably so, Klopp got rid of his sort of depth pieces in attack, your Minaminos and your Divock Origis of the world. And so all of a sudden, he went from having 5 guys to having 3. And 2 months ago, if you would have told me Roberto Firmino is going to be out here playing a key role, I would have said, well, something's probably gone wrong, and something did go wrong. I mean, I guess that's still a fair assessment. But it's not because of Firmino out there. Firmino's been phenomenal. But those are the 3 guys moving forward through, we're talking probably up to the World Cup, that you're relying on an attack. That really scares me. If there was one, if you hadn't lost Jota and Diaz, I would feel much better about this. But it is still Liverpool. Andy Robertson is back playing well. Like I said, they seem to have sorted some things out in terms of the chances they were giving up and just this weird disconnect between the defense and the midfield and all that stuff. And now you got a little bit of confidence going come off this win against Manchester City. And you followed it up with another 3 points. I can make a case for all 4 of those teams finishing third. And I can make a case for all 4 of those teams finishing sixth. And then you got to throw Newcastle in this mix too. I've been banging the drum for Eddie Howe since he got this job. I do not understand why people thought this was a questionable or strange hire. I just will never understand that. Am I convinced they can hang for 38 games? No, not quite. They haven't been good enough so far for me to believe that, but they are a factor in this equation that needs to be mentioned. Brighton have really fallen off. Part of it is the games they've been playing. Part of it was that was not sustainable. And part of it is they've stopped putting the ball in the net. I've talked about this extensively. All of the beautiful possession-based stuff, all of the XG, doesn't get you very far if you don't actually finish your chances. And it's the difference between having, your Salahs, your Kanes, your Sons, your Mounts, Aubameyang, Sterlings, your Rashfords, Fernandez's, Ronaldo's, your Martinelli's, Jesus's, Saka's, Odegaard's. You can go down the list. And being Brighton, with all due respect. That's always been the question for me, and what it's going to take for them to go from being the 8th best team in the Premier League to the 5th or 6th is you got to go for an entire season taking your chances. They did a great job of it for a while, and now they're starting to struggle with it again. And that might just be the end of their top 4 hopes. Because I see 7 teams I feel good about at this point. And Brighton, I feel good about Brighton. Brighton is not one of those 7 teams. Brighton is 8 for me, probably. So, I'm going to talk about these 7. But I just have I'm going to continue to back Graham Potter. I really like what I've seen from Chelsea, and they're starting to put wins together. I know that winning streak came to an end here, but I'm a believer in that. United's going to have to prove it more for me to buy them as a team capable of finishing a top 4 with this many legit contenders. And Liverpool's going to have to prove to me that they're capable of failing to make the Champions League. So right now I'm still going to bet on those 4. City, Arsenal, Chelsea, Liverpool. Probably in that order. Wouldn't be surprised if it goes a different way. I don't feel good about that at all, to be honest. But I'm going to back Graham Potter and I'm going to back Jurgen Klopp. And this group of players from Liverpool that has done this so many times before. And is starting to play much, much better. The way these points are getting dropped by these teams in that top 4 race means that Liverpool was still very much alive, even though they started so poorly. They just needed a couple results to go their way and to pick up a couple points they probably weren't expecting to get, or some of these other teams aren't going to get. Maybe that's the better way to put it. And, beating Manchester City is one of the ways to do that. They still have some work to do to continue to catch, and again, those injuries are concerning for me. It is a reason, not an excuse at this point for Liverpool. But the rest of the team is starting to get healthier, starting to play better. Those are just ultimately the 2 teams I have the most faith in. Outside of just assuming Arsenal and Manchester City are going to be top 4. That's really what it comes down to for me. I like what I've seen from Erik ten Hag. I love the players available to Antonio Conte. There's a piece missing for both of those teams, though, that hasn't shown itself yet. I feel better about Liverpool and Chelsea at this point. And I do think Newcastle still ends up 7th. But we're getting to the point with the money they have and the way they're performing that I'm not there yet, but we're probably going to get to a point pretty soon here where we're going to start talking about this as a big 7 and reevaluate the way we see this league because of the combination of Newcastle's money and Newcastle's performance. Don't think we're quite there yet, but we're starting to need to be paying attention to having that conversation. That's all I've got on the league as a whole. I just wanted to talk about some of that on the back of these games today. We've had good title races between Liverpool and Manchester City, but the fact that everybody is kind of clumped in there together makes this season even more interesting for me. I hope it continues this way. I really think it might. And when you talk about why the Premier League is the most popular league in the world, it's because things like this are possible. And it makes it awful fun to pay attention to and awful fun to talk about.